an original.
From Story Studio Network.
I'm Dave Trafford.
I'm Erin Trafford. Welcome to this episode of Canadian Forestry Can Save the World.
This is the podcast series where we explore the role the forestry industry can play in fighting climate change.
And today, we dive into some of the innovations, the new thinking, and approaches around the old way of doing things. What are you doing?
What?
What are you doing?
I'm watching YouTube.
What are you watching?
Sawmills.
Sawmills.
Yeah. I went down something of this YouTube rabbit hole, checking out the sawmills after we finished that last episode, talking about the use of biomass. Watch this. They're cutting a 32-inch pine log into 2x4s. And it doesn't take long to realize there's a lot of, round log left over when they're cutting a square or rectangular lumber from the tree.
Okay, I get it. But can you shut it down?
All right. Okay. You know what? Watching these video tours of sawmills is kind of cool. Small to large operations. They've all got the same issue. What do you do with all that, in air quotes, wasted wood? I mean, it's throughout a lot of comments I actually saw online. What happens to the bark? What happens to the other parts of the log that don't go into the lumber?
It's a really good question. And I'd say it's a pretty important question, too. And the answers are at the heart of this whole series, Canadian Forestry Can Save the World. So we know from our previous discussions that forest management is the key to mitigating and preventing disastrous wildfires. For example, it means forestry companies need to make sure they effectively clean up the bush after a harvest. They leave some biomass, some of those branches and the bark, on the ground to help the forest regenerate. But they also remove a good deal of it in order to avoid this buildup of tinder.
Yeah, and the use of that biomass for a variety of products, including biofuels, is becoming more and more popular.
And the same thing goes for all these leftover trimmings as well at the sawmill. The bark, the branches, that sawdust, all the wood chips, they're used to manufacture things like wood pellets for fuel. And they're also used to manufacture those engineered wood products, those products you touch and use every single day around your house.
So using that biomass, that wood left over once the log's been milled for lumber, it helps accomplish a couple of goals. First, it's a cleaner fuel alternative to fossil fuels. And we know the stated objective from the COP28 summit back in the fall of 2023 is to, quote, transition away from the use of fossil fuels. The second is using that biomass to manufacture engineered wood products only extends the period of time that wood continues to sequester carbon.
Illustrating the imperative for us to use the whole log to make sure that we use every bit of the tree we harvest. Well, let me clarify that. Yes, we want to use every bit possible of the trees we harvest, but before we talk about this, I want you to meet Etienne Vezina.
I'm Etienne Vezina, Senior Director Forestry with Resolute Forest Products based out of Montreal.
He works for Resolute Forest Products in Quebec. They manage a number of forests throughout Canada, and they do all the maintenance and harvesting operations that you might expect to provide raw timber for lumber. But they don't just harvest healthy trees. They salvage trees from burned forests. He and his crews will go into a forest almost immediately following a fire and salvage any and all timber that can be used for lumber, pulp, and biomass.
Yeah, I had the chance to sit down and talk to Etienne a little while ago about that salvage process. Now, first and foremost, he says they have to get in there and get the job done fairly quickly after a fire. Otherwise, the bugs move in and basically render all that wood useless. And of course, that infestation also provides a recipe for future fires.
When we begin the salvage operation, as soon as it's possible after the fire is extinguished, we'll get same kind of percentage of what we normally have in a regular operation, but the quality will decrease quite rapidly as soon as the insects are growing their presence in the burnt area. So we'll see our lumber will decrease in quality. So we have different grades that we can use. So it might remain in lumber at some point at the beginning. But more and more, we'll convert some of these into chips for pulp and paper production as we lose too much quality for lumber. And the third step would be to convert some to biomass. So it may be for pellet production. It may be to just use the biomass to produce energy for our own pulp and paper mill. So there's plenty of way that we can use the fiber before it's really unusable.
Yeah, I got the whole notion of using the whole log has been an important part of our conversation. But again, we're extending that into making use of the whole log, even if it's been damaged by fire.
Absolutely, we usually use about 99% of what we harvest to optimize the fiber that we bring to the mill. It will just be redirected depending of the quality that we have after the salvage operation.
I would never have thought we were salvaging wood from a burned out forest.
Well, yeah, me too. And actually, it's, as I understand, it's been going on for quite a while. Etienne says the amount of salvage, which surprised me, the amount of salvage they do rivals the amount they would actually harvest of new forest in any given year.
For some of our facility this year, it's almost 100% of what was supposed to be the planned harvest that became salvage harvest. So we could completely shift our operation into salvage operation.
Interesting to hear, though, that Resolute undertakes this kind of salvage operation, even when it means it's more expensive than that focusing solely on harvest operations.
Yeah, it actually might be a good example of where good government policy is supporting good forest management practice, because it's a legal requirement in the province of Quebec for companies like Resolute that manage forests in the province to undertake these salvage operations. They have to do it.
Okay, so what about the other provinces? Do they have similar requirements?
It varies from a province to another, but generally, when it's possible, they are all salvaging the wood that is burned. We've seen it in BC and Alberta. They had quite a good amount of fire in the past years, and they were salvaging those areas.
Well, whether it's a legal requirement, these post-fire salvaging operations are in practice right across Canada, most recently, and based on the fires we saw in Alberta and British Columbia.
Okay, so these post-fire salvaging operations may not be new in the grand scheme of things, but it is interesting to hear how they've been rolled out into provincial forest management plans.
Yeah, the practice may not be new or, quote, innovative in and of itself, nor are the products they produce. But it's the thinking around the salvage operation that's innovative here. The science and the policy lens on using the whole tree actually helps reframe and modernize forest management planning. The priority isn't simply just to get the most product out of the forest. It's about ensuring the forest is also as healthy and as resilient as possible in the wake of these fires.
Agreed. But let's not understate the importance of the salvaged products. Etienne and his team are salvaging wood that goes into lower grade lumber, wood chips for pulp and paper production, and biomass. The biomass can be used to manufacture wood pellets as biofuel. Otherwise, Resolute will use the biomass to generate power for things like its saw and pulp and paper mills.
Yeah, that's becoming a fairly common industrial practice for the forestry companies. Now think about it. This goes well beyond using the whole log. It's the basis for a business model that captures carbon and then contributes to a net zero result.
And that's where we're seeing some of the most interesting innovations. Meet Ben Goodyear.
I'm Ben Goodyear. I'm the head of bioinnovation with Canfor.
He leads the bioinnovation team at Canfor. Canfor started business as a furniture and paneling veneer company in 1938. Now, since then, it's expanded operations to become one of the world's largest producers of sustainable lumber, pulp, and paper.
And among other things, Ben is tasked with exploring new ways to use the wood that comes from the forestry they manage and the wood waste that lands in their mills.
We're exploring new ways to create more value from our forest resource. And our team is at the heart of that in Canfor.
And he says those resources, the wood products, become all the more valuable when we consider them in terms now of putting a price on carbon.
A lot of these things become more economic as people put a value to carbon. And biogenic carbon, which is part of the natural forest cycle, is more valuable than fossil carbon. It's beneficial.
Biogenic carbon. It's a fancy phrase for the carbon that comes from plant-based materials like trees. And there are a number of areas where the biogenic carbon can be and is being used to replace or reduce the amount of fossil fuel carbon in products you use every day.
One way is that we use some of our fibrous material to displace something that would otherwise come from a fossil source. So that can be a plastic, where we're putting in a resource that we have into a plastic substitute.
So we can use wood product to replace fossil carbon in plastic?
Yeah, and there are some really cool applications in the works.
All right, that sounds important, but I also feel like we're just nibbling around the edges here. The real focus is on the use of fossil fuels and this transition away from the use of fossil fuels.
We are also developing, Canfor itself and other providers or forestry players are developing ways to convert our solid residual into liquid for transportation fuels. So that can be a direct energy application.
They're working on ways to convert wood product into liquid for transportation fuel. Let me say that again. I sound like Joe Biden. But they're working on ways to convert wood product into liquid for transportation fuel.
We're in the midst of building a plant in Prince George that will convert lower value or lower productive resource into an oil, which will go into the refinery complex. And so that plant initially will produce 50,000 barrels per year, which is not a huge sum in the scheme of oil consumption. But it's the first step, and it will prove the technology works at scale.
The oil they produce is mixed into the fossil fuel refining process.
We've chosen a path that makes a liquid from a wood feedstock. That liquid then goes into a typical refinery. So we are a biofuel that will go into the refineries. And by putting our product in, you're backing out what would have otherwise come from a fossil source.
So adding that biofuel component into the process makes for cleaner gas and diesel.
It will be blended into a refinery, and it will become a gasoline, or it will become a diesel. So that's sort of the first building block. And then there's aspirations for additional application, be it aviation fuel, be it other uses.
It lowers the carbon output when it's burned.
The term that's used is carbon intensity.
It lowers the carbon intensity, is what they say, in the fuel.
Carbon intensity is a certain amount of carbon emission per unit of energy. That's how it's defined.
So how does that carbon intensity in fossil fuel compare to the mixed fuel that would include the wood product?
The carbon intensity of fossil fuel only is relatively higher. It pumps out a higher carbon emission per unit of energy generated.
The number's notionally in the high 80s is what they claim, or they don't claim. It's scientific. It's just a fact. It's like a 88 carbon intensity for fossil.
The carbon intensity of the biofuel is about 2/3 of the fossil fuel.
When we talk about our first product, it will be about 30. So that's like a 65% reduction in comparison. And we have aspirations to go lower.
Okay, so neither of us is really good at math or chemistry. But if I understand correctly, adding the biofuel into the fossil fuel refining process makes for a cleaner burning fuel.
Yeah, that's fair. I mean, to be clear, it's going to be a long time, if ever, to be realistic, when we don't rely on some level of fossil fuel. When you consider the global daily demand for crude oil is somewhere north of 101 million barrels per day.
Per day?
Per day.
We will be using these fuels for decades. It's not a quick solution here. The transition will be quite hard. And so we will need products like ours to help make that bridge. And 50 years from now, as an example, if we've transitioned the economy off of a fossil system, we will be using our product for something new. It would be a chemical substitute or a aviation fuel or something that's really hard to abate because our product is quite flexible.
So adding biofuels to our gas or diesel or aviation fuel will be part of the carbon solution, but not the whole solution. So using the whole log, even if it's from a burned out forest, can provide material for lumber, wood chips, pulp paper, and biomass that can then be turned into biofuel. And then some of that biofuel is being used to refine cleaner gasoline, diesel, and aviation fuel.
And it illustrates a great example, again, of how the private sector can work with government to promote this kind of innovation. Government policy requires forestry companies in Quebec, for example, to salvage the wood from a burned out forest. And in the case of Ben Goodyear's work, governments are placing a value on carbon that creates a business opportunity for companies like Canfor to create added value from the forest products they harvest.
And demonstrating that added value makes it easier to frame this whole question of ROI and attract investment in new and innovative wood products and technologies. Meet Aaron Howald.
My name is Aaron Howald. I'm the Vice President of Investor Relations and Business Development for LP Building Solutions.
It's his job to attract investors at LP Solutions, where they produce engineered wood products like the siding on your house, or maybe materials to build the garden shed in your backyard.
And they do it by committing to the use of the whole log. We talked to Ben Goodyear about Canfor creating fossil fuel alternatives. LP Solutions has developed oriented strand board. You see it everywhere. It's a wood product alternative to basic plywood, and it's a no-waste process.
Oriented strand board is a product that was invented about 40 or 50 years ago as a substitute for plywood. It's more sustainable, it's lower cost. It's easier to tune to have lots of different performance characteristics. But when you make OSB, basically what you do is you turn logs into product and waste as little as possible of everything else, right? So there's this concept called mass balance, which is what percentage of the logs go into finished goods, what percentage of the logs go into heat, what percentage of the logs go into byproduct to maximally efficiently use that product. And we've got that nailed down and dialed in to the point that we are, what leaves our factories in terms of wood is basically finished goods, some steam, because remember, we buy logs and logs are about half water when they come onto our facility, and some waste heat. There is essentially no solid waste stream of wood that leaves our plants. And to the extent that there is, we sell, in some mills, we sell a little bit of bark. In some locations, we have ash from burning the fines that then gets spread on farmers' fields and is used as a natural fertilizer that offsets synthetic fertilizer. we end up producing about 80% of the thermal energy we consume using that biomass. And that offsets an enormous amount of fossil fuels.
Aaron can tell you that no waste, net zero is all good news. And he can tell you that story in about 90 seconds. But that doesn't make his job any easier, primarily because, as we have heard, he still has to deal with that general misperception most people have when they think about the forestry sector.
I think most people just don't think about the forest industry outside of the incorrect stereotype, that it's just indiscriminate clear cutting, turning forests into lumber, and then moving on.
Only confirms what David Coletto at Abacus Data has told us. It's not that people don't care about our forests. It's that they're not top of mind.
Just under half of Canadians say, I don't know very much about it to have an opinion, right? And so that's the starting point for an industry like this, is that for so long, we just didn't hear about it. We just didn't even think about where the wood products or the lumber we use to build our homes or the decks or whatever it is we might be doing around our home, or where that toilet paper or tissue paper comes from that we use every day.
Yeah, and we heard David talk about how tough it is to break down preconceived notions or ingrained perceptions that may have no basis in fact.
There's still this considerable number of people who think of the forestry industry as lumberjacks in buffalo plaid, swinging those axes that hack and clear cutting the forests.
These legacy industries that have been part of our country's history and our economic growth forever, people assume these aren't innovative industries. And the more you get to know about what's happening and the opportunities that exist, the more you actually start to see that these are very innovative companies that are trying to make money, because they're still businesses, but do it in a way that's as sustainable and that's as efficient as they can be.
And what's interesting is we don't have that kind of attitude toward other industries that rely on harvesting.
If you look at another agricultural product like corn or soybeans or something like that, people are used to seeing multiple cycles of harvest and replanting and renewal and harvest and replanting and renewal for products like that. But they don't, that's happening in forestry too. It's just on a different time scale and people don't generally see it as much.
Yeah, we're not emotionally connected to a cornfield, not as much as we might be to the forest. But it's the same premise. You need to harvest the corn if you want more corn. Harvesting the forest isn't just about producing wood product. It's a vital part of forest regeneration and resilience, and that's good for the environment.
People fail to recognize that there is no better technology for carbon uptake than a healthy forest. And healthy doesn't necessarily just mean leaving it alone. Healthy can mean management as well. And when you manage a forest, you have a younger and more structured age distribution of the trees in the forest. Younger trees grow faster. Fast-growing trees soak up more carbon. So it's not just that the forestry industry is doing a small amount of damage. It's that the existence of a sustainable forestry industry is actually a net positive for the health of the forests and thereby for the health of the planet.
Healthy forests, healthy planet. And that's not only the story Aaron tells to investors. Contributing to and maintaining healthy, resilient forests is part of LP's mission and their business model.
On the other end of the spectrum, though, we've got holders who have been in the stock for 20, 30 years, and they know that every product we sell is made out of trees. And so if we're not doing absolutely everything we can to make sure that there is a sustainable supply of fiber and that we have reliable access to it, we don't have a business model at all. And so the questions I get from them are questions like, what are you doing now to make sure that 10, 20, 30, 50 years from now, LP will have access to that fiber and that fiber will exist? I mean, just last year, we celebrated our 50th anniversary, rang the closing bell at the New York Stock Exchange on 50 years to the day. I probably won't be around to celebrate it, but I want to make sure LP has a 100th anniversary.
And investors who buy into that mission ask some tough questions, and they want assurances that a company like LP Solutions just isn't ticking boxes.
As I describe our business model to investors, I know that the positive environmental benefits that we have are real and not cynical. It's not like we have tax subsidized windmills on top of our plant and we're buying a bunch of carbon offsets and then I'm claiming some environmental benefit for our company. That's not true at all. It's just deeply inherent to the way we source raw materials and the way we use them and the types of products we make. That means that we have a portfolio of carbon negative products that also happen to look better and perform better than many of the competitors.
And what else is interesting is we talked a lot about this life cycle of the forest in the previous season of the podcast. In this case, the forest that's being harvested today to manufacture LP products will be ready for harvest again before the siding or the OSB has passed its lifespan.
We turn trees into products that have a longer duration of life cycle than the tree itself did. Which means that carbon is going to be locked up for potentially longer than it would have been if the tree had just been left in the forest. In the southern U.S., we make our product out of southern yellow pine. That has between a 15 and 20 year replacement cycle. And the product that we make out of it lasts multiples of that. And so right now, our mills are running logs that we ourselves planted. In fact, we're running logs that are 2 and 3 generations into us having replanted.
You can start to see immediately that cyclical benefit when a company like LP Solutions works with nature. The forest regeneration takes 15 to 20 years, and the manufactured wood product lasts considerably longer. So not only are we capturing carbon through this new growth of the forest, that carbon remains sequestered for decades past the time those trees were harvested.
So that's a great story, right? But again, as David Coletto and Aaron Howald will tell you, the forestry sector needs to do a better job at articulating it.
Good for us that we have a clean process and carbon negative products, but we need to do a much better job. And we have started recently with help from lots of areas within the business. We need to tell that story better.
I genuinely also believe that forestry has a very good story to tell.
Forestry does have a good story to tell. And sure, you can always refine and improve that story. But I dare say there are signs the story is gaining traction. The public is listening. And as David Coletto's research underlines, they're interested in hearing and knowing more. Governments appear to be paying attention. The federal government of Canada has established tax incentives for those who invest in biomass heating and energy technologies. I'm quoting here from the government's statement. Quote, turning waste biomass into electricity and heat is, on a life cycle basis, a carbon neutral energy solution with potential to be carbon negative when combined with carbon capture, utilization, and storage, while providing new opportunities for major Canadian industry.
And that's not nothing, right? I mean, when you start throwing around phrases like, carbon negative, that's important. Governments officially recognizing the use of sustainable biomass to help us meet our emission targets and to make life more affordable for families and businesses. It becomes a kitchen table conversation.
And that's the kind of thing that supports an innovative ecosystem.
Ben Goodyear at Canfor says that's promising for forestry and other sectors.
There's a lot of support for innovation in Canada. Generally, forestry is one piece of that puzzle, but as a whole, there's a lot of support, which is good.
But Aaron Howald says it's not just about government spending money.
If we want to drive innovation, what we need is for a government to protect property rights, land rights, protect the environment such that corporations can be as innovative as they can possibly be within a set of sideboards that make sure that there aren't unintended consequences to going too far in one direction or another.
So innovative thinking about new climate realities, innovative approaches to old ideas, they all contribute to this overarching effort to curb carbon emissions and combat climate change in a meaningful way.
All right, so let's stick with this idea and the call to transition away from fossil fuels.
We're going to talk to David Marshall at Resolute Forest Products in the next episode.
We've actually been coal-free since 2014 at all of our facilities.
Resolute runs a number of facilities in the United States that were powered by coal.
A big part of replacing the coal at those facilities was introducing biomass as the fuel source.
They've eliminated the dirty coal carbon emissions by powering their plants with biomass.
And we'll tell you about plans to heat an entire community in Nova Scotia using biofuels.
Thanks for listening to Canadian Forestry Can Save the World.
It's a podcast series produced for Forestry for the Future by Story Studio Network.
So for our producer, Becky Coles, our technical producer and audio editor, Mike Trutler, and for Aaron and the whole team at SSN, I'm Dave Trafford. Thanks for listening. This podcast series is produced for Forestry for the Future. And for more information, I'd encourage you to visit the website forestryforthefuture.ca. And you may want to get involved in supporting a sector that's committed to growing a greener economy and driving our country towards a net zero carbon future for you and your kids. I'm Dave Trafford, and Canadian Forestry Can Save the World is produced by Story Studio Network.
This
is SSN.